China's taking over the world, and Joe Biden is worried about gas stoves. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. The ridiculous foreign policy strategies of this administration. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. When was the last time you remember that America was respected on the world stage? Maybe even a little bit feared. It's not that long ago, and it wasn't under this administration. It was the former administration, the Donald Trump administration. That's when the world really didn't know what to expect from America when it came time to foreign policy, when it came time to considerations of whether, say Russia should aggress at this particular time or North Korea should launch a test at that particular time. Nobody knew around the world how far Donald Trump would go to defend America. And that's a strength. When enemies don't really know what to expect from you, then you're the one in control. You're the one with the upper hand. You are the one with the strength. Well, under Joe Biden, all that strength has rapidly disappeared. And before I get into more of that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, where you may also subscribe to my 3 times a week newsletter. Go to the bottom of the page, find the newsletter section, click on Cheryl Chumley Bold and Blunt. Put in your info and you will be signed up for my Monday, Wednesday, Friday newsletter containing all my commentaries that I write, giving you the bullet points you need, the information, the data, the facts. There's that F word the Democrats hate, facts, that you need to fight the Democrat lies and deceits and propaganda. And it also contains my Tuesday and Thursday Bold and Blunt podcast, which you may also get, by going anywhere podcasts are offered and signing up there. And I want to also quickly mention from our Washington Times sponsors, you need to protect your IRA and your 401k with gold now. Yes, right now. Call Republican Metals at 800-783-3118 to get your free gold guide. Yes, free gold guide. 800-783-3118. Your free gold guide right now. Listen to this. Let us go back in time a little bit and play Joe Biden's own words coming out of his own mouth. This was in 2022. His assessment of climate change.
I come here today with a message. As president, I have a responsibility to act with urgency and resolve when our nation faces clear and present danger. And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
That was in Somerset, Massachusetts. He was delivering a speech. If you couldn't pick up from his slurred words exactly what he was saying, and if you couldn't, then you're not alone in that, right? He called out climate change as a clear and present danger, and then he repeated it, and he made sure that you understood that it was not figurative, it was literal. It's a clear and present danger. And so that came after his White House put out this helpful little memo on whitehouse.gov, right, where they post all the fact sheets and the briefings and the statements that the president makes. And this particular one came out October 2021, fact sheet, prioritizing climate in foreign policy and national security. So if you're wondering why Joe Biden's administration is busily attacking American citizens for their use, their determined use, their continuing use of gas stoves, all the while China's taking over the world, that One Belt, One Road initiative and whatnot and such not and so forth and so on and on and on. Well, that's why, right? From the very beginnings, Joe Biden's administration vowed to push, and continues to push climate change as the focal point of foreign policy. And that sort of puts America in a position of weakness, to put it bluntly. From day one, I'm reading from whitehouse.gov, the fact sheet prioritizing climate in foreign policy and national security. From day one, the Biden-Harris administration, or as Joe Biden might refer to it, the Harris-Biden administration, has authorized addressing the climate crisis both at home and as a core element of our national security and foreign policy. The climate crisis is reshaping our physical world, with the Earth's climate changing faster than at any point in modern history, and extreme weather events becoming more frequent and severe. Wildfires, extreme flooding, unprecedented levels of drought. You know, you go back through history and all these weather patterns were part and parcel since the beginning of time, right? Since Adam and Eve were booted from the Garden of Eden and they had to deal with all kinds of repercussions for their disobedience. And to Democrats, though, that is just a myth. That's a story and so forth. And like any good Democrat believes, if you only have the right regulation, you can control the weather. You can control weather patterns. And in the Democrat way, regulations mean controlling your activities, but not theirs. And that's why you see all these Hollywood types traipsing all around the world in their private jets to touch down at events in Africa and Davos and shake their fingers at the world and tell them to stop driving cars and using gas stoves and breathing too much, really, and kill the cows because the cows are contributing to climate change and atmospheric devastations and so forth. And then they jump back on their private jets and go home to their gated communities where they pen their next commentaries for the New York Times about the need for gun control and to strip law-abiding American citizens from their abilities to use guns. That's how Democrats think, right? It's all about thee and not me. And so when you have a Democrat administration as weak as the Joe Biden administration, you get Democrat policies that push ideas through national security agencies that deal with weather patterns and not weapons. This is not a surprise with any Democrat, but this is particularly not a surprise with the Joe Biden administration because they campaigned on this crap, right? They campaigned on it. And they implemented executive orders and policies and agendas and memos and talking points and so forth from day one, pushing climate change as the forefront issue in all their agencies, not just those dealing with intel and national security and so forth. And now we are at the point where China is rapidly taking over the world. And this administration is still, what? We need to eat fake meat. We need to stop driving. But it's more than that. It's more than just China coming on strong. It's Russia, Ukraine. It's the messaging to the world who is watching America, waiting for America to bring that strong leadership that America needs to bring to the world stage, and watching as this administration is falling flat and as hostile players of the world are busily pushing their agendas forth. And I have a guest today. He's been on before, and I love his foreign policy analysis. He is Rear Admiral retired Mike Hewitt. Mike, it is so great to have you back on Bold and Blunt. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Cheryl. It's always good to be back with you, and it's great to have you back on the show again.
Thank you. So you just came back from Ukraine, and it's one of a handful of trips you've made. What's going on over there from the ground perspective?
Yes, I have. I just returned back from Ukraine again, and our focus, my focus, has been on the recovery and reconstruction planning that needs to start to take place now, before the war's over. And in some ways to help accelerate the end of the war. But there are so many challenges on the ground in Ukraine that we need to recognize, not unlike Afghanistan, where you have corruption, you have graft, you have infighting amongst the different parties. Our focus needs to be obviously winning the war, but more importantly, focusing on the recovery of Ukraine and bringing the kind of transparency and governance and legitimacy to that country that it needs to have because it is such an important country in Europe for us. And the fact is, they're fighting Putin, who is our NATO adversary, and we need to do much more to help them. But I will tell you this, that the people of Ukraine are committed to protecting and saving their country. The cities of Kyiv and others during the day operate almost like normal cities. And 100 kilometers away, there's conventional fighting going on. So it's a very interesting, almost surreal dynamic on the ground in Ukraine.
Transparency is problematic, right? Especially when you consider the millions upon millions of dollars from taxpayers in America that are going to fight on behalf of Ukraine. And transparency with where that money ends up has been a problem and an issue. How concerned should American taxpayers be that their money is being spent properly?
Well, I think it's interesting because it actually is happening in both directions, because the Ukrainians have committed a lot of money to bringing equipment and hardware into the country that's also vanished because of opportunistic companies that have taken advantage of the war on the ground. And so it really works both ways. We have to do a better job of keeping account for the money that we obligate to Ukraine. On the other hand, we have to help them with their own accounting principles, because a lot of the money that they're committing to really important equipment on the ground, and also equipment around the commercial side of Ukraine, is vanishing. So there are profiteers on both sides of this, and we really have to get in front of it, not only to win the war, but to ensure that this deep-seated corruption that came from the Russians and has been part of Ukraine's fabric for the last 30 years, if we don't address that, this problem will never be solved.
I'm glad you just brought up corruption, because that was the next question I wanted to ask. Prior to Russia-Ukraine war, we had around the world lists that put Ukraine at the top for corrupt governments. Where is should we be concerned about that?
When Zelensky came in to office, he won on a platform of cleaning up the corruption of Ukraine, of finally getting rid of the oligarchs and the Russian influencers that were a holdover from the pro-Russian governments up until 2014. And of course, you had the invasion of Crimea during Obama's presidency, which really changed the dynamic completely with respect to Ukraine. Zelensky was not the guy that they brought in to fight the Russians. But unfortunately, he was the one that was in office when it happened. So there is a clear understanding that what we set out to do in Ukraine to clean up the corruption and the Russian influence is still embedded in every aspect of their government. But they know it. They want to fix it. President Zelensky is working very hard to purge the Russian influencers out of their government. They're everywhere, undermining not just U.S. support to the war in Ukraine, but undermining his ability to have good governance to conduct the war. There is as much conflict happening inside the Ukrainian government as there is on the battlefield.
You spoke a couple minutes ago about the need to win the war, and this raises an issue that to me is very discomforting in recent years in America, the fact that we don't declare wars anymore, right? By the Constitution, it's Congress who has the power to declare wars, and the War Powers Act has really given the executive the power to use our military for warlike situations without having to go through Congress. So when you talk about winning the war, what's our entry and exit strategy here? Isn't that part of the problem?
It is, and I think that obviously the War Powers Act and how it has evolved over the last few decades, it should really give everyone pause for the amount of power the executive has to get involved in conflicts short of war. And that's obviously what's happened time and time again, where the War Powers Act actually isn't set into motion because we're not declaring war. But in this particular case, we have committed billions of dollars of resources to supporting the Ukrainians. And what I mean by victory is, from a military perspective, ends, ways, and means. If we have said we want Russia out of Ukraine, okay, well then we have to give them the ways and means to affect that outcome. Instead, we talk that outcome, but we don't resource it. So, to your very point, we either commit to victory or we don't. And when we tend to say, here's the end state, but not resource it, we create these stalemates that we're seeing right now in Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's going to be the problem going forward with this administration, though, right? Because they're wishy-washy. They're all talk, diplomacy, send money, but when it comes time to taking hard stances and drawing decided lines in the sand, all that stuff is in the wind.
It is, and I think that this weakness on the world stage that the administration has demonstrated, going back to Afghanistan, Syria, and other places, has really created a vacuum that the Russians have taken advantage of, and so have the Chinese. We continue to shoot behind the target, as we like to say, with respect to supporting Ukraine on the ground. If we were to give them the resources that they need and they ask for, this war could come to an end fairly quickly. But instead, we dribble in the resources, and we oftentimes don't give them exactly what they need. So yes, this Biden administration weakness on the world stage, and then not resourcing the victory that they claim they want to have, is seen by everybody, particularly Russia and China.
Is there a dollar amount that you can put on it? Can you say with assurance right now that if America were to give X amount, then the war would end by X date?
Well, I think if you compare the amount of resources that we would spend if we were in a conflict such as this, which I can't even imagine, this is minuscule compared to that, because we're not talking about putting forces on the ground. We're not talking about committing any U.S. blood and treasure to this whatsoever. And we're really not talking about giving them the highest end equipment. But for what we can contribute to them, it is a very, very small percentage of our Defense Authorization Act. But I can't imagine what we'll have to do to increase our defense budget if we don't address this issue on the ground in Ukraine today.
So you mentioned a minute ago about creating vacuums because of the weakness of this White House administration, and I 100% agree. And that segues nicely into, I wanted to bring up with you how America's influence in Africa is shrinking. And meanwhile, Russia, China, even Turkey are all sort of exploiting that weakness. What is the danger there? What is the problem that America must confront?
It's a very complex issue when it comes to Africa, but if you look at what the continent of Africa needs, the United States is not providing them anything that they need. Meanwhile, Russia and China are giving them exactly what they need. These countries in Africa would much rather work with the United States, and they know exactly what they're getting into with Russia and China. But instead of legislating climate change or human rights activities or the things that we tend to lead with our foreign policy, the Russians and the Chinese are leading with debt relief and food and energy. And we need to understand what's at stake in the continent of Africa. And I'll give you one of the most recent examples was the coup in Niger just 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
And this coup was actually supported by Prigozhin and the Wagner Group, who were really executing Russia's foreign policy throughout Africa. And meanwhile, the same week, Putin is hosting a African summit in Russia.
Yep.
With the world leaders of Africa. They're operating as if they are the 21st century global superpower along with China. Meanwhile, we're busy trying to argue for decarbonization. We're simply not addressing the most critical needs of the African continent, which is food, water, electricity, and other services to run their countries. And we're busy telling them that they have to decarbonize or they have to get out of fossil fuel. So our foreign policy, which seems to be centered on an ideology around climate change, is not the right foreign policy for the 21st century.
Now, this may be more delving into the politics than you like to go, so I'll let you answer it however you address. But what you describe, when I'm listening to you and I've read about what you just described, my immediate thought is this administration is not stupid, right? The White House is not filled with stupid people. So it must be by strategic design that they are purposely setting out to weaken America on the world stage. And if you look at some of the other politics involved with that, there is much to support what I just said. How do you see it?
I wish I could understand what the strategy is with respect to the administration right now, because it doesn't pencil out at all.
Right.
We continue to talk about the greatest existential threat of our time being climate change, and that we have to get out of fossil fuel. Meanwhile, Russia and China are doing the exact opposite, and the world tends to be following them. So I don't understand it. And the term that I've started to use, without getting too political, is appropriated ideologies. So we have this ideology of climate change, or we have an ideology called Black Lives Matter, or an ideology around LGBT, and it tends to define much of our foreign policy and domestic policy. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is moving in a completely different direction. Our U.S. national security strategy seems to be focused in one area, which is climate. And meanwhile, Xi and Russia are focusing on growth, industrialization, and that they have taken a much more pragmatic and phased approach to decarbonization than the United States has. I simply can't figure out how we put our national security strategy together versus what I see from the rest of the world.
Well, here's something else then that might be even more baffling for you. I know we were due to talk about China's unrestricted warfare plan, which goes to China's bold moves on the world stage as America recedes. And so when I was doing a little bit of research on the current state of China's warfare plan, unrestricted warfare and so forth, I came across a headline from our own Department of the Air Force's China Aerospace Studies Institute. The headline reads, "Unrestricted warfare is not China's master plan." So it seems like our own internal government entities are denying that China even has an unrestricted warfare plan.
That's really one of the most frightening aspects of this, is because the Chinese, and if you follow what they do, they write their doctrine, they publish it, and then they execute it. And it is clear to us that they've written this doctrine of unrestricted warfare, and they're using things such as the Belt and Road Initiative and Made in China 2025 to execute on this doctrine. The Chinese, and there's very little argument against this, are dominating most of the advanced technologies today. That the Chinese have used the Belt and Road Initiative to exploit their own foreign policy at the expense of the United States. And for us to ignore exactly what Xi is doing and broadcasting what he's going to do in a very aggressive way, whether it's Taiwan or whether it's support to Russia or whether it's interference in Africa, we are in real trouble if we don't start to pay attention to exactly what the Chinese are doing.
Well, let's just say that this administration, Joe Biden, is not going to pay attention to what China's doing or what anyone else is doing except climate change, which I think is an accurate statement. Where do you see us at the end of Joe Biden's term?
It's really hard to say because I think we have such a long way to go. But at the pace of play that we're seeing both in Russia and Taiwan, I'm very concerned that we're going to see another conflict in the Pacific that could be around the takeover of Taiwan. If you look at the interaction with China by the administration just in the last 3 months with Yellen, John Kerry over in China just last week trying to get them to commit to climate change, and obviously that was a failure. The victory from that meeting was that we'll continue to talk. Meanwhile, the Chinese are building coal-fired plants every day, dominating our civil nuclear power industry, focusing on things that the world cares about. And then Secretary of State Blinken, most recently, really being beat up by the foreign policy of China around their military growth, around exercises with the Russians and the Chinese off our coast in Alaska. I think the Chinese are really becoming very aggressive right now because of this administration. And so the timeline over the next 24 months is one that we really need to keep a close eye on.
And just to finish up with this one question, because it's possible that this may, in fact, be a positive for this administration, but Joe Biden, as you know, just sent 3,000 sailors and Marines to the Strait of Hormuz to stop Iran from seizing ships. Is that something that is a good move on the part of this administration?
I think we really need to get involved in those kinds of things. I mean, Iran and North Korea in particular, as basically adjuncts of Russia and China, have become more and more aggressive because they're getting the support and the backing they need from the Russians and the Chinese. So we really do need to get involved in ensuring the free flow of commerce, and that the IRGC and the mullahs of Iran, who will continue to become more and more aggressive in that region, we absolutely have to get involved to protect U.S. assets, U.S. resources. And I really wish we would understand statecraft again when it comes to the Middle East. It appears we put so much of our effort into supporting Iran through the JCPOA, and we really haven't paid attention enough to our Sunni Arab allies. And the Abraham Accords is still the most active agreement in the Middle East that President Trump put together.
Right. And
thank goodness for that, because otherwise we would have no leg to stand on in the Middle East right now.
And he still gets no credit for it. It's unbelievable. One of the most important treaties or accords to be formed, and Donald Trump still gets no credit for it from the Democrats anyhow.
Well, had that accord not been in place, I would be worried that we would even be further off track in the Middle East because of the support of the administration, the ongoing support for the Iranians, the continued admonishment of the Sunni Arabs, Mohammed bin Salman and others, when they continue to try to reach out and work with the United States, but they're not getting any support from the administration. And I think that's of grave danger in that area of the world.
Wow, dark times under this administration. I really do appreciate you taking a few minutes and weighing in with your expertise. Mike Hewitt, thank you so much for being back on Bold and Blunt, and I look forward to having you back again.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Oh, for the days when America was respected and feared even on the world stage. We haven't felt that since the last administration, right? More reason to vote Donald Trump in 2024. Indictments be danged. I want to thank you for listening. Remind you, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, at Real Life Network. And don't forget to check out the Washington Times' newest news product, Higher Ground. All your news from a faith-based perspective. One quick mention before we go: if you are a conservative and you are retired, Republican Metals believes you need to protect that savings rate now. Currency change is coming now. Call Republican Metals at 800-783-3118. That's 800-783-3118. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay blunt.